I started my career actually working on the west side in community organizing. So actually kind of share that background with former President Obama. Community organizers sometimes get a bad rap, but we were happy that one actually became president. So I think now maybe community organizing is taken on a new level of esteem. And then I spent about 10 years working in city government. I was the planning commissioner for about 4 years, and then I was the head of the Chicago Park District. And while I was the head of the Park District, we did some really fun projects like Millennium Park and Soldier Field, and then we did a lot of neighborhood improvements and put a lot of resources into rebuilding our neighborhood parks. I then left the Park District and started Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives. So I think the thing says citizens. It's actually Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives. So we're a nonprofit community development corporation located on the far south side in the Pullman neighborhood. How many of you are familiar with Pullman? A few, yep. So Pullman was this 19th century industrialist who was one of the first people to develop the worker town. So this was innovative back in the 1880s. Pullman had this idea that if you gave people a nice place to live and you provided them with all these amenities, they would be peaceful and happy and content workers. And all of that was going fine until 1894, when there was a recession. And when the recession struck, Pullman decided he was going to cut their wages, but he wasn't going to cut their rent. So that created a little problem for him, and ultimately it ended with a strike. The first labor strike in American history occurred in Pullman. We actually have Labor Day today because of the Pullman strike of 1894. And ultimately the government came in and forced him to sell off some of the privately owned homes and some of the commercial businesses. And so we actually, using that history, both kind of the town planning and urban planning history along with the labor history, and the third element of American history that runs through Pullman is the African American history. So Pullman was one of the first large employers to hire African Americans, and we have the Pullman Porters, who were very important in the early civil rights movement, was the first African American union. And so we have these three unique elements of American history that run through Pullman, and because of that, President Obama actually in 2015 designated Pullman a national park. So we are the only national park in the city of Chicago, and only the second in the state of Illinois. So we're very proud of that, and we're now trying to build off of that and create more tourism and more economic development around the national park. So that's a little bit background. So the topic I was going to talk about today, this idea of this tale of two cities. So this has become, I think, importantly, much more part of our public narrative in the city in the last probably year and a half. And it's been particularly acute with the election of Mayor Lightfoot. So for those of you that have been following her kind of campaign, she very much ran on a platform of equity and fairness, and wanting to make sure that there was that some of these disparities were being bridged. So we see this a lot when you look at the areas where we work on the south side. So this is no great secret for anybody, but obviously if you look around downtown, you see all this investment, you see lots of skyscrapers, and then if you look to the south or to the west, you see a very different story. And I think in many ways, Chicago is often described as kind of one of the most, it's perhaps the most American of American cities, right? So we're the heartland. We very much are kind of this amalgam of different races and ethnicities, and we've been a kind of a heartland and a seedbed for innovation over the years. And so what you see in Chicago, you see you see the parts of America, particularly those on the coasts like New York and Boston or San Francisco, which are growing and expanding, and really have kind of fettered growth. And then you see other parts of America like Detroit and Cleveland and Flint and other places that are represented on our south and west sides. So what does that say? I think in many ways it represents America. You see parts of America that are doing very well, and then you see the middle class that's getting squeezed. You see this disparity in incomes, and so we have all of that in Chicago. And so there are three kind of points I just want to make. One is on the home mortgage lending disparity. You may have seen yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there's an article about African American home ownership. African American home ownership right now is at the lowest level in recent history. And a lot of that is because of student debt. So we work a lot on home ownership, and by far the number one barrier to getting young people, and African Americans in particular, into the home buying market is student debt. So I think, when we think about large kind of public policy issues, we've got to think about how do we start to really address this huge overhang of student debt. And my argument is, until we start to deal with that, you're not going to see millennials in particular start to enter the home buying market at the rates that maybe their parents did, or even their older brothers and sisters. The second is in public investment. Again, if you look across the city, you see, and I can say this having been and worked for the city and also for the Park District, you see all these investments in public institutions, new parks, new libraries, new train stations, but that always doesn't translate out to the south and west side. So the best example I'll give you is, how many of you ride the Red Line? Red Line, right? So the Red Line goes all the way up to the city's border, goes all the way up to Howard on the north, right? And then it goes all the way down to 95th Street on the south. So many people think that the city's boundaries actually stop at 95th Street. The reality is the city extends another 4 miles further south. Can you imagine if the Red Line on the north side stopped at Addison and didn't go to Howard? How do you think that would work, right? So you'd have civil unrest. People would, but for years we've accepted the fact that there's this disparity in public transportation on the south side. And then finally, I'll just talk quickly about small business lending. So we have one of the things that we do is we provide small business loans to neighborhood businesses, and it's very hard work. But it's also very fulfilling work. But most of the businesses that we work with could never get a bank loan because their credit scores aren't necessarily what the banks would require. They don't have the sufficient collateral, and the loans are quite honestly too small. I mean, you can't really even get a banker's attention if you're not asking for at least $500,000 or more. So consequently, a lot of entrepreneurial efforts are thwarted before they ever get started because people don't have access to capital. And so we've got to continue to find ways to encourage small businesses and then find ways to seed those businesses. And on the encouraging note, I am encouraged by the new federal program called Opportunity Zones. How many are familiar with Opportunity Zones? Some of you, yeah, so that's probably a whole nother seminar. But Opportunity Zones allow investors to defer their capital gains, and if they invest them in Opportunity Zones, they can basically eliminate their capital gain if they hold the asset for more than 10 years. So we're starting to think about how do we apply that and how do we get more investors putting equity into these small businesses, because that's really what's needed. And it's also what's going to redevelop and rebuild our neighborhoods. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you for your time.
We read dozens of news sources, so you only have to read one. John Lothian News.